Martavas had cut 11 feet into the hillside behind her cabin, swinging a pick through shale and clay until her palms split and her shoulders burned like brands. The territory watched her haul out rock by the barrow load and said nothing kind. A smokehouse built into the earth, they said, was a smokehouse built for nobody. Meat needed air. Meat needed a roof that breathed, not a throat of stone that would hold damp and rot and worse. Her grandfather had believed otherwise, and he was 3 years dead. Old Martavas left behind a notebook bound in waxed canvas, its pages soft with handling. Marta kept it in her coat now, against her ribs, the way some men kept a flask. Cut where the rock holds cold, he had written, not where the sun forgives you. 41 degrees at 4 feet of stone, year-round, wet season or dry. Smoke slow, smoke long. Let the mountain do what the mountain already knows. She had not understood the numbers the first winter. She understood them now, mostly, and understanding had cost her 9 hogs worth of meat gone green and sour in a chamber she'd cut too shallow, too close to the surface, where the frost line reached in every February and turned her curing racks into a swamp. 41 was the number that mattered. She had cut to 26. The second cut, she went to 58 feet of depth into the slope, angled the smoke channel 11 degrees off her grandfather's original mark to account for the harder rock on her own hillside, and lined the walls with river clay to seal the seep. The chamber held 39 degrees through the whole of that August. She wrote it in a ledger of her own, started fresh, her hand smaller and tighter than her grandfather's had ever been. Day 1, 39 degrees, 4 ounces smoke loss per side of bacon. Day 9, 38. Day 20, pure holding, no bloom, no must smell. The Grange chairman, Ezra Colm, came to see it in October, boots clean, hat square, the kind of man who trusted a barn he could see the whole of at once. He stood at her cave mouth and looked into the dark the way a man looks into a well he suspects has gone dry. Rock don't breathe, he said. Meat needs air moving over it, or it sweats itself rotten. It's not sweating, Marta said. Come feel the wall. He didn't. He touched the doorframe instead, as if that told him anything, and left before the smoke had even caught proper in her firebox. She wrote his visit into the ledger too, because she had begun to write everything into the ledger, the failures and the doubts alike, the way her grandfather never had. Martavas's notebook held technique. Marta's held consequence. Her only hand in the work was a boy named Isham, 11, silent since a fever took his hearing 2 winters back, who signed to her in shapes she was still learning and who trusted the cave more than any grown man in the territory did. He slept some nights near the mouth of it, on a bed of cut grass, because the temperature inside never changed enough to wake him. Her dog didn't share the boy's faith. Bracken, a rangy blue-eyed cattle dog she'd taken in as a stray, would go as far as the threshold and no farther, hackled, whining low, refusing the dark no matter how many times she called him. She told herself it was only the smoke stinging his nose. She was not entirely sure she believed it. 80 miles east, across 2 mountain passes and a river that ran high with snowmelt, Cormick was being laughed at for an entirely different reason. He kept the worst cattle in 3 counties, by every outward measure. Ribby, short-legged, ill-tempered, the kind of stock a man culled rather than bred. His neighbors ran fat Herefords on the good bottomland and pointed at Cormick's ugly little herd grazing the high scrub where nothing else would go, and called it a rancher's shame. His Aunt Ruth had run that same herd before him, and before her death had left him a ledger of her own. Not smoke ratios, but bloodlines, forage counts, fat content measured by hand-pressed rendering. Keep the ones that winter ugly, she had written. A pretty steer is a steer that needs you. An ugly one needs the mountain, and the mountain doesn't quit on you in January. Cormick's first attempt to prove her right had nearly ruined him. He'd bred 40 head onto the driest ridge pasture he owned, expecting the herd to toughen the way his aunt's ledger promised. Instead, 19 died that winter, gaunt to the bone, and he stood over the carcasses doing the arithmetic that told him he was a fool with a dead woman's notebook and no sense of his own. He went back to the ledger instead of walking away from it. Ruth had written forage counts he'd skipped past the first time. Sedge and bitter brush ratios, 3 parts to 1, salt supplementation at a specific ounce count per head per week that he'd been too impatient to bother measuring. He measured it the second year. 2 ounces of salt, then 3, watching the herd's coats for the change Ruth swore would come. It came. The cattle that had nearly starved him the year before came off the ridge in April thick-muscled and hard-footed, carrying more tallow under the hide than any Hereford in the valley. Nobody believed the second-year numbers either. A rancher named Otis Ferry rode out just to see it and pronounced the whole herd cursed-looking, healthy or not, and said no butcher in 3 counties would take stock that ugly to market. They don't need to be pretty, Cormick told him. They need to be alive in March. Otis rode off unconvinced, same as Ezra Colm had ridden off from Marta's cave unconvinced, though the 2 men had never met and didn't yet know they doubted the same shape of thing from opposite ends of the territory. Cormick's own dog trouble came from a horse, not a hound. A stubborn gray mare named Salt who refused, every single time, to cross the ice-rimed creek below his home pasture, though every other ford on his land she took without complaint. He'd stopped fighting her about it. A horse that particular about one crossing and easy about all the rest, his aunt's ledger noted in its margins, is telling you something about that ground. He didn't know yet what. By the second week of November, the cold came down off the mountains early and did not lift. Marta smoked through it without trouble. Her chamber didn't know or care what the surface weather did, and she logged the steadiness of it with something close to pride. 39 degrees, day 40. 39 degrees, day 51. She had 600 pounds of bacon and shoulder curing in the dark, more than she had ever held at once. And for the first time townsfolk who'd mocked her came asking prices instead. Cormick's trouble arrived differently, not from his own herd, which wintered exactly as promised, but from everyone else's. A blight moved through the valley's hay stores that autumn, a mold nobody caught until the cattle started scouring on it. And by the first week of December, 3 of the territory's largest herds were dying in the field faster than their owners could butcher and salvage them. Fat, pretty Herefords, bred soft, collapsing in droves on ground that had fed them fine every year until this one. The territory's meat supply, which had never depended on ugly ridge cattle or a hole cut into a hillside, began to fail all at once. Ezra Colm called an emergency Grange meeting on the 9th of December, and it was there, in a room lit by 2 lamps and heated by a stove nobody had banked properly, that the scale of it became plain. For of the valley's 6 major herds were compromised. The territory's central smokehouses, the proper, above-ground kind, built the way smokehouses had always been built, were already crowded past capacity trying to process what could be saved before it spoiled further, and half of what they processed was spoiling anyway, because a warm Chinook wind had rolled in behind the cold snap and turned the outdoor curing racks into a slick, sweating mess. "We need meat, and we need it held," Ezra said, to a room that had no answer. "And we need it held somewhere that don't care what the weather does." Nobody in that room said Martavas's name. Nobody said Cormick lies either. Pride ran deep in a territory that had spent 2 years mocking both of them. It was Isham who broke it, in his way, riding 40 minutes through dark and half-frozen mud to reach the meeting, signing frantic and fast to the one man there who'd bothered to learn a little of it, an old blacksmith who translated haltingly, "The cave. She's got room. She's got cold that don't move." Marta arrived an hour behind the boy, snow in her collar, and found the room already arguing about whether a hole in a hillside could possibly hold what 4 dying herds' worth of meat would require. She didn't argue back. She opened the ledger. 58 feet of depth, she said. 39 degrees, unbroken, for 11 weeks running. I have 600 pounds curing right now that never noticed the Chinook came through. Bring me what you can save, and I'll show you room. Ezra Colm looked at her the way he'd looked into her cave mouth in October, like a man staring down a well, still waiting to be proven right about the dryness of it, and who's driving livestock through a blizzard to reach a hole in a hillside 80 miles the wrong direction. He said, when half the herds left standing are already dying where they stand. That was when the door opened on Cormick lie, hatless, half frozen, having ridden 2 mountain passes on word that had reached him the same night, through a rider Ruth Lie's old neighbors had sent without much hope of it matching. Mine aren't dying, he said. Mine are the only herd in this territory that isn't. The room turned on him the way it had turned on Marta. Disbelief first, arithmetic second. His ugly ridge cattle, fat underhides nobody had bothered to admire, 310 head strong and untouched by the blight, because they'd never touched the blighted hay to begin with, wintering on sedge and bitterbrush exactly as his aunt's ledger had promised 2 winters running. Ezra Colm looked between the two of them, the woman with the cold hole in a hillside and the man with the ugly cattle nobody would buy, and did the arithmetic out loud, the way a man does when he can no longer avoid it. You're telling me the territory's meat supply for the winter is a ledger of tallow ratios and a hole in a hillside? I'm telling you it's the only meat supply that's still standing, Cormick said, and still cold enough to hold. They did not trust each other in that room. That mattered as much as the doubt from everyone else, though it went less spoken. Marta had heard of the ugly cattle and privately doubted an animal bred for hardship could carry meat worth the trouble of hauling 80 miles. Cormick had heard of the cave and privately doubted any hole in the ground could hold 300 head worth of slaughter without turning, sooner or later, to the same rut every root cellar in the territory turned to by February. They agreed to the drive anyway, because there was nothing else standing between the territory and a starving winter, and grave doubt was still better arithmetic than none. The drive took 4 days across 2 passes in weather that killed 11 head outright, and would have killed more if Cormick's herd hadn't been bred for exactly this kind of ground. He kept his own ledger moving the whole way. Head lost, feed consumed, condition of hooves on ice, the way his aunt had taught him to track a herd's suffering instead of guessing at it. Salt, the gray mare, balked twice at ice crossings on the route, and was proven right both times, the ice giving way under a scout's lighter horse just downstream of where she'd refused to step. Marta spent those 4 days widening her chamber's second gallery, a length of rock she'd cut 2 summers back and never finished sealing, working with Isham by lamplight to line the walls and set the smoke channels true. Bracken would not enter that new gallery either, not at first, whining at its threshold the same way he had at the original mouth 2 years before, and Marta began to wonder, working alone in cold rock with a dog that would not follow her, whether some part of the animal understood the ground better than she yet did. She found out what he understood 4 days later, when Cormick's herd came down off the last pass into her valley, and the Chinook wind, which had broken once already, rolled back through warmer and wetter than before, the kind of thaw that turned frozen ground to mud and threatened every open-air holding pin in the territory with the same spoilage that had already ruined half the valley's salvaged meat. 300 head, slaughtered in a rushed and brutal 2 days of work by every hand the territory could spare, needed somewhere cold to hold the meat before the thaw ruined it the way it had ruined everything else. Cormick's own ledger told him the tallow yield alone was going to run higher than any of them had feed room to render. Pound after pound of rendered fat, with nowhere proper to store it, and no time to build storage from scratch. Marta's cave held the cold. It did not, on its own, hold enough sealant to pack that much meat against the damp of a chamber suddenly asked to do 3 years' worth of work in 3 days. Her clay lining, sound for 600 pounds cured slow over months, was not built to seal the volume now arriving at her door in a single frantic week. It was Ezra Colm who saw it first, standing in the cave mouth with a barrel of Cormick's rendered tallow at his feet, meant for market, and now going begging along with everything else. She needs sealant, he said, more to himself than to either of them. He's got sealant standing in barrels he can't sell because nobody trusts an ugly steer's fat any more than they trusted his ugly steers. He did not wait for either protagonist to agree. He put his shoulder under the first barrel himself, hauled it into the cave mouth past the dog who would not follow, and broke the seal with his own knife. "Pack it," he said. "Both of you. Now, before the thaw finishes what it started." Marta and Cormick worked the chamber through that night side by side, her clay-lining knowledge meeting his fat-rendering knowledge at the exact seam where each had, alone, run short. Tallow sealed the racks against the damp. The Chinook was still pushing through the hillside's outer rock. The cave's steady cold, unmoved, unmoving, indifferent to whatever the sky above it was doing, held the meat from spoiling while the seal set. Neither method alone would have carried the territory through that week. Together they carried 300 head of meat and 11 weeks of cured bacon through a thaw that ruined every above-ground store within 40 miles. Bracken crossed the threshold near dawn, tail low, nose working, and lay down at last in the gallery he had refused for 2 years, as if the smell of tallow-sealed rock had finally told him what the cold stone alone never had, that this ground, now, was safe. Ezra Colm stood in the cave mouth at first light, tallow on his hands to the wrist, and said nothing for a long while. Then he looked at the two of them, hollowed out with 2 sleepless nights, and said the only thing that passed, that whole winter, for an apology. "I was wrong about both of you separate," he said. "Didn't think to be wrong about you together." Marta wiped clay and fat from her hands and looked at the man whose ugly cattle had saved what her cave alone could not have held. "Your steers carry more than I gave them credit for," she said. "Your hole in the hill holds more than I gave it credit for," Cormick answered. Neither said more than that. There was meat to finish sealing, and a territory outside the cave mouth that would need every pound of it before spring came back around. And grief and doubt both make poor company next to work that still has to be done by hand. The chamber held through the whole of that winter at 39 degrees, exactly as Martavas' notebook had promised 20 years before either protagonist was born to prove it, and the tallow seal held with it, exactly as Ruth Lie's ledger had promised in its own margins, written by a woman who'd never once set foot in a cave. By March, the territory that had mocked a hole in a hillside and an ugly herd of ridge cattle in the same breath was hauling both, in the same wagons, to families who had nothing left of their own soft, pretty herds to eat. Nobody wrote a new saying about it. Nobody needed to. It had always been true, long before either of them cut rock or bred cattle, that the ground does not care what a man thinks looks right. It only holds what it is asked to hold, and gives back only what was put in with patience, and no shortage, however wide, has ever been ended by a method too proud to stand beside another.